Bienvenidos todos. Good evening on this beautiful October cooling evening. We got a few things going on here at Casa con la Plaza, and today we have with you Thomas Saenz from the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, one of the co-chairs of Prop 16, Equal Opportunity for All. And we're going to get into it, but letting you know, of course, that La Plaza de Cultura y Artes is bringing you En Casa con la Plaza, which are conversations, presentations, demonstrations, and performances from our home to yours. It's our way of fulfilling our mission to tell the little-known stories of Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and all Latinos in the foundation, growth, and evolution of the LA area. If you're on Zoom, you know we have our chat feature. You could ask us questions. We have a Q&A. If you are on Facebook, the same. We have our comments. You could ask us questions. Let us know where you're viewing from. And we'll probably save the questions for later on, but please let us know what's going on out there in the world with so much going on. And of course, the election coming up pretty soon. So Thomas Saenz is our guest, as I said. In August 29th, he returned to the Mexican-American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, also known as MALDEF, in August 2009 as the president and general counsel. Prior to that, he served on the staff as counsel to LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, where he honed his leadership skills by serving on the four-person executive team to the mayor. He had previously practiced civil rights litigation at MALDEF for 12 years, and that's where I first met Thomas at MALDEF. That's full disclosure. I also worked at MALDEF for a couple of years as their director of communications, and that's where he first came to the organization. During that time, he successfully challenged California's unconstitutional Proposition 187 and led numerous civil cases in the area of immigrants' rights, education, employment, and voting rights. Since he's been back with MALDEF, he's been in challenges to California's congressional redistricting, initiating employment discrimination lawsuits, numerous awards. He's been in front of the Supreme Court on behalf of the community. And with that, I introduce to you Thomas Saenz. Tom.
Thank you. Good to see you, Abelardo. I got started here when you were here. It was a different era in the 1990s, a different era for Latinos in California. I know we're going to talk about that.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit about going back to those times. We had at the time a trio of propositions which greatly affected the Latino community. One of them, of course, we know Proposition 187, which sought to ban undocumented immigrants from accessing state services. That measure passed, but was later found to be unconstitutional. And you were part of that court case, weren't you?
Yes, I was. Yes, that was a very important victory for civil rights because Proposition 187 would have had devastating effects, not just for the undocumented, but really for everyone living in the state of California who would have had to prove their status anytime they wanted to even enroll in school. So it was really a draconian overreach driven by the then governor, Pete Wilson, who, as you know, used Prop 187 to secure his own reelection to office. It was a quintessential racial wedge issue that he used to inspire folks from the white community to vote in 1994 and to re-elect him in 1994.
And he did in fact get reelected, and the proposition did in fact get passed by the voters. But as we said, it was overturned. And in what year was that, Tom?
Well, it was held up almost immediately in state court and federal court. So there was an injunction. So it was basically never implemented except for two minor provisions relating to punishing use of fraudulent IDs. But the big provisions banning access to social services and requiring everyone to demonstrate their status, because if you were reasonably suspected of being undocumented on that basis alone of suspicion, you could be denied services, but those were never implemented. And ultimately, the case was resolved, I believe, 5 years later, when a new governor, Gray Davis, was in office, and we were able to negotiate an end to the case, which had been appealed to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals by Pete Wilson.
And that, in fact, has been seen, the passage of Prop 187 has been seen as kind of like a very historic turning point for Latinos in the state, in which, having seen this onerous proposition passed, they banded together to really fight against that proposition in particular, but also all these other discriminatory measures that were taking place, and fighting for political power, and eventually leading to the not the destruction, but really the irrelevance of the Republican Party, Pete Wilson, and those types of efforts.
That's right. Really, lots of pundits, I think, with justice, have identified Proposition 187 as a major catalyst for changing California from what was then a purple state. Would vote for Republican presidential candidates as often as Democratic presidential candidates, and had statewide officers from both parties, to where it is today, one of the most progressive states in the country, and in particular, one of the most immigrant welcoming states in the country, with much of the legislation that's been put in place and implemented in recent years. So a dramatic turnaround over a quarter of a century. And a lot of it was catalyzed, at least in the beginning, by the divisive measure that Proposition 187 was.
And this year's the 25th anniversary of the passage, and there is a great interest in that. In fact, a group which aided by La Plaza de Cultura y Artes, Somos California, is celebrating the fact that it was fought against and it was overturned. And so if you check on your PBS listings locally, you'll see that there is a documentary about Prop 187, and I believe you're part of it as well. Is that correct, Tom?
That's right. It was created for the 25th anniversary of the election, which was last November, to make sure we all remember what really started the turnaround in California. And it was the dramatic increase in civic engagement. You saw folks who had been here for decades choosing to naturalize, become citizens, and then to register to vote and to participate. You saw among young people a greater commitment to become involved, many of them running for office. I think the documentary explains how many of our current legislative leaders will really trace their involvement in politics and policy making to the experience they had when they were much younger under Prop 187. And then, of course, it was followed by Prop 209 2 years later, and Prop 227 2 years after that. So the 90s were a difficult time, particularly for the Latino community in the state of California.
All right. Or real quickly, that third measure that you spoke of, Proposition 227, it effectively banned bilingual education in the state, but voters overturned that ban in 2016. But let's go back to what Proposition 209, which is basically the catalyst for Proposition 16. So tell us a bit about that, please.
Absolutely. So Proposition 16 is a repeal of Proposition 209. And Proposition 209 was enacted in November of 1996, so 24 years ago. And it too sprung from Pete Wilson's desire to create a racial wedge issue, using the growth of the Latino community in particular to inspire fear among white voters and to then catalyze their showing up at the polls. But it actually began a year before 1996 with two resolutions passed by the University of California Board of Regents to ban affirmative action at the University of California. And those two resolutions were put forward by one of Pete Wilson's appointees, a man who had worked as a staffer for Wilson earlier in both of their careers, named Ward Connerly. And Ward Connerly put forward these resolutions, and they became the precursor for what would be Proposition 209 a year later in 1996. And I think it's important for folks to know one of Pete Wilson's that, like Proposition 187, in its intent, it was a racially divisive issue, and it played out that way at the polls. So we know from the LA Times exit poll that supermajorities of voters of color voted no on Proposition 209. In fact, Latinos, perhaps because of the clear connection to Proposition 187, had the highest no vote of all voters, with 76% voting no. 74% of African Americans voted no on Proposition 209, and 61% of Asian American voters voted no on Proposition 209. But because in the 90s, there was so much of a mismatch between the composition of the population and who was voting, it still passed with 55% of the vote in November of 1996. And what it did is added a new provision to our state constitution to prevent the use of affirmative action, race-conscious or gender-conscious affirmative action in public education, public employment, and public contracting. And folks usually focus on higher education, but it's important to note that this has affected not just higher education, but K through 12 education as well, that it's affected public employment and opportunities for women and employees of color, that it's affected public contracting in a dramatic degree, preventing women-owned businesses, minority-owned businesses from accessing contracts that they otherwise would have the ability to access under the use of affirmative action. So it was a divisive measure, and in the end, folks of color voted against it. But nonetheless, it went on the books and has been in our state constitution for almost a quarter century, 24 years.
What have been the real world effects of this proposition and its impact, like you say, education, employment, and so on, that have impacted people in general, but Latinos in specific?
Well, I think you look at what we're all even more aware of today in light of the pandemic and the indications that communities of color, including Latinos, are suffering at higher rates from infection and death as a result of the pandemic. And you see the statistics about the similarly disparate effects on Latinos and others of the recession catalyzed by the pandemic, and with the recent really important demonstrations across the country in the aftermath of the police murder of George Floyd, also creating greater awareness and recognition that systematic injustice, systemic racism is real, and it manifests in the kind of discrimination, discriminatory effects that we all have in our headlines day after day in this extraordinarily unusual year. But for the Latino community, some of the effects of Prop 209 are hidden, and they're hidden because of the growth of the Latino community. So the example comes from higher education, where just a few weeks ago, we saw headlines that said, for the first time, Latinos are the largest group among those admitted to the University of California. And that's a tremendous milestone and one worthy of celebration, but it does not by any means indicate that the Latino community does not still face systemic injustice and discrimination in the education arena. Because the truth is, if we didn't have Proposition 209, we should have passed that milestone of being the largest component of UC admits a long time ago, a decade or longer. And here's the stark statistic. 54% of high school seniors at public schools in California today are Latino. So 54% of 12th graders in this state are Latino. These are the kids right on the cusp of going on to higher education. And yet, you look at the University of California system-wide, and Latinos make up only 25% of all undergraduates system-wide at the top higher education institution in California, the University of California. That's 54 versus 25. That is a 29-point gap. And it's that kind of huge discriminatory disparity that Prop 209 has prevented us in this state from acting aggressively to address. And that's the biggest harm for the Latino community and really the entire state of California, is that this proposition has prevented us, all of our policymakers who respond, of course, to the public, respond to their constituents, but it has prevented them from taking the most aggressive steps to root out those discriminatory outcomes. Indeed, it has prevented even discussion of steps short of affirmative action to address those disparities. And the reason that it's prevented that discussion is because no elected official anywhere in the world is going to highlight an issue like the kind of discriminatory disparities that lead to 54 versus 25. Nobody wants to highlight that if in the end they're not going to be able to fix the problem. And because 209 says you can't take the steps, all the steps that might be required to fix the problem, our elected officials understandably don't want to go into an in-depth look at those discriminatory disparities, because in the end, Prop 209 will prevent them from taking the steps to fix it. And you know, nobody wants to say, here's a problem, but by the way, I can't fix it.
Yeah.
That's not what politicians need to do. That's a sure ticket to trouble with your next election.
And California is one of the few states in the nation that have effectively banned affirmative action. Is that correct?
It is correct. We were the first. Now, unfortunately, this is one of our shameful exports from California. The proponents of Proposition 209 took it upon themselves to seek to replicate it in other states. And they succeeded in doing that in 8 other states. So there are now 9 states that have banned affirmative action. I think one of the most recent, I think it's the second most recent, is the neighboring state of Arizona, which in 2010 passed its duplicate version of Proposition 209. So with the Prop 16 campaign, we really see this as not only an opportunity to reverse that 1990s era of racially divisive issues targeting the Latino community, but also a chance to start a trend for the nation that counters the trend that began with 209. So we can start here with eliminating it and move to the other states that replicated it in subsequent years.
Now this Proposition 16, it was introduced by Assemblywoman Shirley Weber, who chairs the Legislative Black Caucus, and specifically to overturn Prop 209. Could you tell me, what your involvement is, and what are the efforts to promote this this proposition?
Sure. As you know, MALDEF has long been a prominent supporter of affirmative action, and that's in court, where we filed to intervene in cases challenging affirmative action throughout the nation. We filed friend of the court briefs in cases before the Supreme Court that challenge affirmative action, so-called reverse discrimination cases. And we have taken a position against Proposition 209 and its replications throughout the country. And we have done that because we believe that affirmative action and the analysis that goes along with it are really critical tools to target and eliminate the discriminatory effects that are felt so keenly in our Latino community. Our role in the Prop 16 campaign, together with many, many allies, because the level of support in all different areas of society for Proposition 16 is really impressive. But I think our particular role is to work with the Latino community, whom we serve every day, to try to secure a vote in support of Prop 16 that parallels the 76% that opposed Prop 209, which 16 would repeal. But the thing is that our growth, not just as a portion of the population, whereas you know Latinos are now 40% of California's population, but as a portion of the electorate. So today, Latinos are 27% of all registered voters in the state of California, more than 1/4. So we have an important role to play here. And if we get to similar levels of support, matching our performance on 209, that will be a big, big step toward repealing Prop 209 and restoring our ability in California to take all of the necessary steps to secure equal opportunity for all.
All right. Well, besides appearing on such popular programs as En Casa con la Plaza, what other efforts are being undertaken by this the organization that you're involved with?
So our campaign is comprehensive and recognizes the challenges that we all face during a pandemic. I mean, the kind of door-to-door canvassing that would have been more common and frequent in prior elections, there's a little less of that for understandable reasons, particularly for those who are elderly, particularly for those who have pre-existing conditions that may make them more vulnerable. We want to make sure that we're respecting the need, whether or not it's respected at the highest levels of the country, that we're respecting the need to treat this pandemic with the seriousness that it deserves. But we are placing television ads to explain not only the important policy behind Proposition 16, but to highlight who supports it and who opposes it. We are placing digital ads that do the same, including some digital ads that target specifically and speak specifically to the Latino community in English and in Spanish. We have Spanish language television and radio ads. I'm proud that this is a campaign, unlike others, that have historically accorded lip service to the importance of the Latino vote, but not really directed resources toward reaching the Latino community. This is a campaign that is investing in reaching the Latino community. But beyond that, we've collected powerful endorsements, not just from traditional elected leaders where we have the Latino caucus strongly in support, where we have elected officials, current and former, from inside the Latino community and outside, but we're collecting endorsements from everyone, and we're getting them. Business organizations, business leaders, those in the arts coming forward, even sports figures have come forward. It's a reflection of the Black Lives Matter movement and its success in getting everyone to recognize responsibility to address issues like rooting out systemic racism and injustice. And that's, I think, why we are seeing so many folks coming forward. The last thing I want to say is this campaign is invested in youth. And we put youth fellows out in communities, online and otherwise, to reach out not only to their peers, but to their parents, their grandparents, to explain why Prop 16 is so critically important to the future of California. And these are youth who reflect that future.
Like with the 2020 election, this general election, first of all, California has, I'm counting here, I just got my paperwork from the state this morning. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 13, almost 12 propositions. So how are you, you spoke of, you know, using digital media, which of course in these times being virtual is super important. I have seen a couple of your ads on TV, but to generate that really buy-in from people to take Prop 16, you know, seriously to heart, to make it a part of their the reasons why they're going to vote. What would be the key, or what is the key?
Well, I think there's two things. One, as you pointed out, we have a dozen measures on the ballot. That means this is a long ballot, and we need to make sure that folks go all the way through. Now, it helps us that the presidential vote is actually in the back of the ballot instead of at the front where it was in prior elections. So hopefully that means folks go all the way through before they get to maybe the main reason they're voting, which is to oust the most anti-Latino president in the history of this country. But we need to make sure that they're aware of all these important measures. And in addition to Prop 16, there are several others that are real steps forward for this state. So we need to make sure that folks see the ballot as a whole and take the steps necessary to become aware of the issues and to respond to them. But specifically with respect to Proposition 16, we have a challenge, no question. Prop 209 was on the ballot 24 years ago. That's a long time. And we have lots of voters who were not voters at the time because they were too young. And in some cases, they weren't even really aware of what was going on in the realm of politics and policy. And even for those who were voting in 1996, they may not recall what Prop 209 was about. They may not even recall what affirmative action is, because we haven't had it because of Prop 209 for almost a quarter century in this state. But we have learned through our polling, focus grouping, that when folks understand what affirmative action is, that it is a critical step toward achieving equal opportunity for all, then there are high levels of support in all communities for restoring the ability to take those steps to root out systemic injustice and discrimination. We've also learned that when folks understand, and this is a shorthand that so many of us use, who's in favor? Folks like Kamala Harris, our senator and candidate for vice president. Folks like Governor Gavin Newsom. Folks like Secretary of State Alex Padilla. Folks like our Attorney General Javier Becerra. These and the Latino caucus, these are all folks who people in California support. And when they hear who's on the other side, folks like former Governor Pete Wilson, with the reputation that he's acquired, recently he worsened even more by his endorsement of Donald Trump. We hadn't heard from Pete Wilson in years and years and years. And he comes forward to endorse one of the most unpopular presidents in the state of California in its entire history, doubling down on his terrible reputation. But when you know that you've got folks like Pete Wilson on the other side, you've got Donald Trump on the other side. Because the fact is the Trump administration has taken as many steps as any administration to target affirmative action where it does exist and is implemented around the country. Most recently, we've seen lawsuits involving Harvard University, a challenge by the Department of Justice to Yale University, cases in other parts of the country. So the Trump administration is very much against affirmative action. But when folks understand that's who's on the other side, and you're making a choice between Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom, Alex Padilla, and on the other side, Pete Wilson and Donald Trump, it's a pretty clear choice, even if you don't have a deep understanding yet of what affirmative action can so positively do for the state of California.
And if and when Prop 16 passes, how soon will it take effect?
So we have a system now where we make sure that we can count all of the ballots. We used to have a rule including back in 1996 and 1994 when 187 and 209 were on the ballot, that initiatives took effect, ballot measures took effect the very next day after the election. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense where we have lots of folks voting remotely by mail, and you've got to make sure that you count all those votes. So this measure will take effect in December. If it's passed, when it's passed at our election, it will take effect in December. But it does mean that our policymakers will then have to take the steps, the deep, thorough analysis and consideration required before you can implement race or gender conscious affirmative action programs. That's required by our US Supreme Court. But that deep and thorough analysis and consideration is all to the good, because it will enable us for the first time in a quarter century to really look at what's causing these disparities and take steps to address them. And some of those steps won't even be called race-conscious affirmative action, but they will have positive effects. For example, it will cause us to look carefully at the continued use of standardized tests in making admissions decisions in higher education, when we know that standardized tests don't actually predict success in universities at all. But we still use these tests because we've used them for decades, despite their having no connection to success, and despite their having dramatic discriminatory effects on Latinos and African Americans. But if we take a close look, engage in the thorough analysis that's required, we'll take steps like eliminating those standardized tests as an element of making admissions decisions. So policymakers will have to follow up. This will not be self-implementing. Policymakers at the University of California, at Cal State University, where we now have selective admissions to so many of the impacted campuses and majors, legislators with respect to the K through 12 system, city councils, county boards with respect to employment and contracting, every government agency, they'll have to take the steps. And it will take community pressure in some cases to have them do the deep and thoughtful analysis that's required, but now permitted as a result of Proposition 16.
Well, as you say, this will be a big change back to when California was a lot more fair to its minority, well, basically the population at large, and to give us equity that we deserve. Now, there are other propositions in the ballots, as you said, that would have a similar impact if passed. Can you just share one or two that would be of use for us to know more about?
Sure. So MALDEF has taken a position on 6 of these 12 propositions, and we've released our ballot guide today, and folks can find it on our website at maldef.org. But we have taken a position in support of Proposition 15, which will ensure that we no longer treat large corporations like they're human beings, but we recognize that large corporations should be paying taxes on their property that is tied to its actual value. Mm-hmm. We also have measures that would expand the vote to folks who are out of prison, out of jail, in our communities, and because they're in our communities, they should have the right to vote. We also have measures that would permit those who are going to be 18 by the time the general election in November comes around, and permits them, out of recognition that they will be 18, to participate in the primary election as well. We also have measures to reform our criminal justice system by eliminating cash bail that often has effects on the poor that are greater than appropriate and greater certainly than on those with wealth. So we've taken a position at MALDEF in favor of a yes vote on 5 propositions and a no vote on 1 proposition, which seeks to go backwards on some of the important criminal justice measures that we previously enacted as California voters.
All right, thanks. I posted on our chat and also on our comment section and our Facebook page links to both maldef.org and also on the Yes on 16 campaign. So please check them both out. And let's.
But Abelardo, I want to hasten to add that the positions I've articulated are MALDEF positions. The Yes on 16 includes a coalition of folks who take different positions on some of those other ballot measures. And that is, I think, an indication of the broad support for Proposition 16. Some folks that you wouldn't always see working together are working together on this proposition because they recognize that no matter your vantage point, no matter your perspective, this is a critical step to allow us to expand our economy, to arrive at greater equity across the board, and as a state, in total, every one of us will do better under an equal opportunity for all regime in California.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. I know that's something that of course MALDEF as an organization has been behind from the 50 years plus of its history, and you as an individual in your 25 years plus as an attorney, civil rights attorney, as a leader in the community, and we appreciate you coming on today to give us more just an explanation of Prop 16, its importance to our communities, and how we can make an impact on society at large, and particularly our people of color, to pass this proposition, Yes on 16. Any final words?
This is an opportunity. This is an opportunity to reverse the damage from the 1990s. You pointed out the Proposition 187 struck down in court. Proposition 227 reversed by voters a few years ago. This is the third of those anti-Latino measures, and we have the chance to reverse the damage from the 90s with a Yes on 16. But more than that, we have a chance as Latino voters, 27% of registered voters in the state, we have a chance as Latino voters to lead with so many others in achieving a future that is more promoting of equal opportunity for women, of equal opportunity for people of color, including Latinos. This is an important opportunity not just to reverse that negative past, but to move forward to a more positive future.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, and moving towards a positive future is what this general election is about. There's so many issues which are that are in front of us, from health issues with the coronavirus, to the economy, to of course equal justice and opportunities for all. We appreciate you coming down or zooming in with us from your offices there at MALDEF on Spring Street here at En Casa con la Plaza. Let me just give a little preview of our next program on En Casa con la Plaza. This Friday, we have San Miguel and his tres. A tres is a stringed instrument from Cuban origin, and San Miguel, you're going to be blown away by his music, being interviewed by Beto Arcos, a good friend who's been on our show a couple times before, an independent music journalist. That's this Friday, October 9th at 7 p.m. In Casa con la Plaza. We're taking the next week off. Next week, we're taking off because on October 14th, we have our annual Pobladores Award Gala. But this year, in keeping with the situation and the crisis we're having, it'll be a virtual gala, a celebration of art and music, honoring Castro de la Rocha, President and CEO of Ultimate Health Services, Chicano arts patron, and Los Lobos, Chicano rock legends. It'll be online. I'm going to go ahead and drop in a URL link that you could learn more about it and how to purchase tickets if you'd like. We are making those available to the general public. Usually we have 300 to 400 people at La Plaza enjoying the night with us, but now it's free to everybody around the world. They could tune in on our Facebook page at La Plaza LA, on Twitter at La Plaza LA, and on Instagram at La Plaza LA. We have a silent auction going on as well. Silent auction is one of the highlights of our gala. So I'm dropping in that URL as well, so you could link up and get your bids in. And that's it for tonight. En Casa con La Plaza. Important election ahead. If you've missed any part of this session, we post them on our YouTube page at La Plaza LA. Also, it stays on our Facebook page at La Plaza LA, and also on our website, lapca.org. Again, thank you so much, Thomas Saenz, good friend and colleague, and hope to see you soon.
Absolutely. Good to see you.
Bye-bye.